The power base of Grand Prix racing moved from Italy to Great Britain. The most famous and revered name, though, was still Ferrari. It was the time for drivers from English-speaking countries to make their mark. In Autofiles, we profile Mike Hailwood, Chris Amon, Peter Revson, Richard Atwood, Derek Bell and Swiss Joe Siffert, all drivers aiming to break through to Grand Prix success. One of the teams that encouraged young drivers was Reg Parnell's Bowmaker team, which had 7 times world motorcycle champion John Surtees driving for them. Following Reg Parnell's untimely death after a routine appendix operation, his son Tim took over in 1964. Joining him were young New Zealander Chris Amon and another world champion motorcycle racer Mike Hailwood.
Yes, without a doubt, Chris Amon, a very, very talented driver. Tragic that he never ever won a Grand Prix. He had wonderful drives with Ferrari and with Matra, and he led several Grand Prix and really was there. They were there for his winning, but mechanical failure prevented that. My father first noticed Chris Amon when he was on the Tasman series, and when he had the chance of taking over the Bowmaker team, he was the first person that my father signed up to drive for the team, his own team at that time. And he was only 19 at the time, but a very talented driver, and went on to achieve a wonderful racing career. Brilliant in sports cars, won Le Mans, won at Daytona. Very brilliant driver.
The other famous name, whose Formula One results never quite lived up to his reputation, was Mike Hailwood, hoping to follow Surtees' successful transition from 2 to 4 wheels.
Yes, Mike, of course, when I was associated with Mike, after my father died, of course, and I took over the running of the team, I mean, in very early days for me, and I was a bit out of my depth in those early days. Mike, of course, was still doing the 2 wheels as well as the 4 wheels, which was rather difficult to do. But without a doubt, Mike Hailwood was a very talented driver. No doubt about it. He was the European Formula 2 champion, and he gave a very good account of himself in Formula 1 once he decided to give up his motorcycle racing and concentrate solely on that. John Surtees really was quite responsible for bringing out the best of Mike Hailwood. Perhaps they didn't hit it off too well all the time, because Mike was a wonderful playboy. I've never known a man as a playboy as Mike Hailwood. It was quite remarkable. You talk about the girls and all that sort of thing, and the followers in motor racing. My God, what a game it was with Mike Hailwood. And of course, at the time when he came to me, we had the situation where Chris Amon, Mike Hailwood, and Peter Revson, who'd come over to race in Europe at that time, sharing the same flat in Ditton Road, Surrey. And my God, what a problem that place was. The police were always ringing me up about my drivers in this flat, and the drama and the confusion and the noise that happened down there.
American Peter Revson, heir to the Revlon cosmetics fortune, had a very colourful off-track life.
Yes, I would say so, yes. Of course, he had that big drama with Miss World, and all the papers and the TV were on about this business. But he was a very nice person, was Peter Revson. And for a driver on a high-speed circuit, he was terrific. When we first went to Spa, the first time he'd seen Spa, which was a ultra-fast circuit, the old circuit, he was way up there with them. He was right up there with them. And then when we went to Enna, to that high-speed circuit they had at Enna in the early days, where there was no corners, and he was terrific on that circuit. And then, of course, he went to Indianapolis, and he was absolutely phenomenal at Indianapolis.
Peter Revson died in practice for the South African Grand Prix at Kyalami in 1974.
Yes, he signed up with of course, he won several races for McLaren. When he was with McLaren, he and Denny Bear were at McLaren together, and of course that was a very good combination. And then he left them to go to the Shadow team, and I was actually out in South Africa with him at the time when the accident happened.
It was a big responsibility for 31-year-old Tim to take over his father's team.
Well, without a doubt, it was a big step for me, but of course, my father had put all this team together. Colin Chapman had kind of let him have two of the Lotus 25s, which was, of course, the car to have at the time, the monocoque 25 Lotuses. And of course, he'd got the engines were going to be provided by Coventry Climax, and he got young Chris Amon and Mike Harewood, and things were looking extremely good for the team. And I remember the sponsors, Keith Ballysat and the other people who were backing us, Laurie Hans with Champion Plugs and Ray Wood of Lucas, and those sort of people, they said, well, we're prepared to go along with you, Tim, and let you have a go and see how you go on with it. But they also said, we wouldn't like you to carry on driving. We think you've got enough on your plate now just to put this team together and try to fulfill what was in your father's mind.
Reg Parnell planned to build his own F1 car.
Yes, we were making, my father was making a Formula One car with the help of Nick Cousins and Les Redman. In fact, actually, Les went on to design a Parnell sports car, which actually won every race it went into, a 2-litre sports car. But it was decided at the time that, well, I thought at the time, I just got too much on my plate to try and run the two Grand Prix cars without trying to develop a Grand Prix car at the same time.
The Parnell team continued in Grand Prix racing with a mixture of BRM-powered Lotus 25s and the old Lola, sometimes swapping the bodywork. With Mike Harewood, Chris Amon and Peter Revson, they performed well, competing against the likes of the British Racing Partnership for positions just behind the works teams from Lotus, Ferrari, BRM and Brabham. The Parnell team's main competition was legendary Scotsman Innes Ireland, who was near the end of his career. His 1964 French Grand Prix at Rouen ended in the bushes. Tim Parnell was supportive of his drivers. He talks to Harewood and Revson about their races.
Good show, Mike. Time, 2 hours, 7 minutes, 29.1 seconds. What did you do before all Innes? Played the English national anthem?
Yeah.
Very good.
He then found time to have a word with Chris Amon.
Somebody just dropped that whole lot of oil there, you know, it was pouring out of somebody's car. I went down there and off the road, you know, where it drops over? Yeah. I go right to the edge of that, you know, I thought, Christ, swing it back again, get it back on the road.
Amon, Harewood and Revson hoped the 1964 season would improve. Brands Hatch 1964, and the first British Grand Prix held there. Peter Revson lined up for the Parnell team alongside Mike Harewood. The drivers weren't entirely happy with their Lotus BRMs in practice and made interesting descriptions, given the Parnell's background as pig farmers.
It's understeering like a pig today.
Yeah, mine is too. Down the paddock?
Everywhere.
Up around Druids, I can't hardly get it around up here.
For Mike, there was never enough time for fun.
And see all these places, but usually you're so bushed after practice and the racing that you just don't get time to see all of it or appreciate what you do see. And anyway, you're always having to move on, you know, as soon as the race is finished, you're always on the trot, you know.
Not much success for Mike Harewood in this race. He spun off at an early stage, and the result was a broken oil pipe, causing his retirement. The accident could have been quite nasty, but fortunately he missed the bank. He was soon back in the pits to tell them all about it. Retirement also for Peter Revson with a gear selection problem. He returned to the USA and re-established his career there before tackling Europe again in the 1970s. Chris Amon had a stop-start career over the next few years, picking up occasional drives with private teams before his luck changed in 1966. Mike Hailwood's best results in GP racing didn't happen until he left the Parnell team, returned to bikes, and then made a reappearance in Grand Prix racing in the 1970s. Tragically, he died in a road accident in 1981, which also killed his daughter. A young British driver who eventually made his name in sports cars was Richard Attwood. He was famous for giving Porsche their first Le Mans 24-hour win in 1970. Attwood had a short Grand Prix career that began in 1964 with BRM and finished with Lotus in 1969.
Well, my first drive was with a factory BRM car at Goodwood in Easter Monday in '64. It was a one-off drive. I think Richie Ginter had gone back to America for some reason. And out of the blue I was invited, because at the beginning of that year I'd been invited to be the BRM test driver. And they didn't have any cars for me to test because Richie Ginter and Graham Hill did all the driving anyway. But I did have this one drive in the old stack pipe tube type Formula 1 car. I don't know what the model was, but Tony was there. And I did actually finish fourth there, and Sir Alfred Owen was there, and he was very impressed. And sort of asked why, was that I couldn't drive for them more often. But that was pointed out to him that they had got Richie Ginter and Graham Hill to use, and he normally ran two cars, and so I think that was the only drive I had that year with BRM. And so the following year, 65, they decided that because I'd been so underutilised, that they had this idea of giving Tim Parnell a factory engine to put into one of their Lotus 25 Formula 1 cars, and that's really, I did a season then for Tim with the factory BRM engine in the back of the Lotus.
The son of a successful motor trader, Richard, or Dickie Attwood, started racing in a Triumph TR3 in 1960. In 1963, he switched to Formula Junior and rose to international prominence, winning the 1963 Monaco Formula Junior event, the most important race of the time. This was in a Lola entered by the Midland Racing Partnership, a group of enthusiastic racers who banded together. He had success in 1964 in Formula 2 with a win at Aspern in Austria, and also raced a Ford GT sports car. In 1965, Attwood drove for Reg Parnell Racing in a Formula 1 Lotus BRM in several Grand Prix, and he finished sixth in both Italy and Mexico. He also spent time testing BRM's four-wheel drive racing car. Swiss driver Joe Seppi Siffert was a driver of promise. He graduated to Formula 1 as a privateer in 1962 with a four-cylinder Lotus Climax, later driving under the Swiss Scuderia Filippinetti banner. In 1964, he joined private entrant Rob Walker. Siffert drove alongside Joe Bonnier, who was at the end of his career. In those days, GP racing still had a number of private owners. Rob Walker, of the famous Johnny Walker whiskey family, ran a private Grand Prix team for over 15 years, starting in the 1950s and ending in the 1970s. Walker made his name with Sterling Moss driving the blue cars with the white stripe as the underdog, the private owner. The limited resources of the private teams always meant that they were a step behind the works teams. Somehow they got the money together to do a full season of racing, travelling across Europe. Rob Walker and his wife were running an effective little team, but they were not having the success that they had enjoyed in earlier years. Joe Siffert did well in non-championship races. In Grand Prix racing, however, he was often unlucky. A notable win was against Jim Clark in 1965 in the Mediterranean Grand Prix, but he could only manage sixth place in the French Grand Prix at Clermont-Ferrand with the Rob Walker car. A couple of fourths was the best that Joe could achieve over the next few seasons. It wasn't until the 3-litre formula that he came good, although he'd developed a fine reputation as a sports car driver. Tim Parnell had moved away from managing his own team to managing BRM, and he was sent off to the 1966 Tasman Series in New Zealand and Australia to look after Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart. Hill won the New Zealand Grand Prix and then went home. He was replaced by Richard Attwood, who also drove a superb series of races, although no one could compete with Jackie Stewart. Stewart took the Tasman Championship easily, although Atwood did record one win in New Zealand. At this time, BRM's prospects looked good, although it turned out to be the end of an era for Britain's oldest Grand Prix team. Chris Amon had moved on to fellow New Zealander Bruce McLaren's new team, driving sports cars with him, although the McLaren F1 cars weren't a priority in 1966. Chris and Bruce were part of Ford's massive assault on Le Mans in 1966, the days of the Ford versus Ferrari battle. After 2 years of disappointment where their cars hadn't lasted the distance, Ford created the biggest racing program ever undertaken, employing every top driver they could muster. After a race-long battle with teammates Denny Hulme and Ken Miles, the winners for Ford at Le Mans in 1966 were Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon. That win helped secure for Chris a drive with Ferrari, which by 1967 saw him as the Scuderia's #1, a welcome turn of events after his disjointed career. When not driving for Ford, Chris Amon was involved with McLaren. When Bruce left Cooper to set up McLaren cars, there was enough New Zealand talent available on and off track to have a complete Kiwi team. McLaren Cars was anxious to have New Zealand drivers, but it wasn't Chris who stayed with them, but Denny Hulme, who moved across from Brabham after winning the World Championship in 1967. And what of Amon? At Ferrari, he was contracted for Formula One and sports cars, which included long-distance races like Le Mans, Daytona and Sebring, the Can-Am Series and the Tasman Series, a full program of racing. This looked like the opportunity he'd been waiting for, to drive for the most famous team of them all. In his first year with Ferrari, he scored Grand Prix points on 6 occasions, but never a win. His second year, 1968, saw him scoring points on only 3 occasions, and in his third year, 1969, it was even fewer, just 1 to show for his work. Amon never lost his speed or his ability, but he just didn't have the good fortune or organisation to win World Championship Grand Prix races. He continued to drive with the same efficiency through the early 1970s. He was good on wet tracks with superb car control. His only single-seater wins during his time with Ferrari were in hybrid cars in the Tasman Series. Amon arranged for a Formula 2 chassis to be fitted with a 1950s 2.5-litre Dino V6 to compete in the Tasman Series, and he was a Tasman champion in 1969. After his stay with Ferrari, he went on to the new March team, and later Matra. Away from racing, Chris Amon was partner in Brymon Airlines, formed in 1972, which operates today as part of British Airways. After the hustle and bustle of a busy but disjointed racing career, he returned to New Zealand to take over the family farm. Another young British driver who was making his way up the racing ladder was Derek Bell. From a Lotus 7 in 1964, Formula 3 with Lotus in 65 to 67, F2 with Brabham and Ferrari in 68, it was a meteoric rise. He made his World Championship debut with Ferrari at Monza at the end of the season. At a recent Goodwood Festival, he was reunited with one of the Formula 2 Ferraris which he'd last driven in 1968.
Yes, I didn't even know it was here until Roger Bailey came up and said, guess what, one of our old F2 cars is over there. Yeah, this was the very first car, or typical of this, and very first Ferrari I ever drove for the factory back in 1968.
What did he remember of his days with Ferrari?
Well, it's probably the most sort of, emotional time of my life, because it was, when you're striving to get on in Formula 2 and Formula 1. And of course they gave me my first Formula 1 drive in the Oulton Park Gold Cup, and that car's here as well, or sister car to it. And also I did my first Grand Prix for Ferrari in the Italian Grand Prix, in the identical car to the one that's here. And then we did the Tasman Series in this car. Chris Amon and I had 2 cars, one each. And it was a very special part of my career, because to drive for Ferrari, it was driving for a man who's a legend in his own lifetime, and it was far more than driving for any other person in the world. For me, it's a far more emotional person to drive for than to drive for Professor Porsche, because, you know, I drove for the old man. I mean, he was actively part of the action, whereas with Professor Porsche, I never felt that close to him.
Enzo had a reputation for being difficult. Was he?
No, it's strange. When I was with Ferrari, he was incredible. At that point, my wife at that time, she was very, very ill, and he was always very, very concerned about her health. And every day I'd go to the factory and he'd say, "How's your wife? Let's phone up the hospital, see how she is," that sort of thing. And he never ever put pressure on me. I mean, he used to say to me, "You know, we've got you a new car for this week, let's see how you go," and I'd always go quite well. But of course, unfortunately, it was the end of an era, really, of this type of Formula 2, and of course the end of the V12 era for Ferrari. They then built the Flat 12, which was a much quicker car.
Bell followed a long line of successful British drivers like Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins, who went to Ferrari, and yet it didn't seem to come right for him.
No, again, I think it was because it was the end of the era. You know, I assume they signed me up because they had the choice of everybody in the world, and they signed me up because I was doing very well in Formula 2, which is the logical way to go. And in fact, my first race was the Lotteria at Monza, and I was on pole position. And my first Grand Prix, I was 6th position, so I guess I wasn't too bad. But you know, the cars really weren't that reliable, and we were stressed out because the Fords were so powerful. They were just coming on really strong, the beginning of the Cosworth era.
Bell had an impressive reputation as a sports car driver, particularly with Porsche. Was he disappointed with his Grand Prix results?
And naturally, I'd love to have won a Grand Prix race with anybody, but particularly with Ferrari, because, I mean, it was never even a dream of mine to drive for Ferrari. And then I got sort of picked up out of nowhere as this young English driver, just saying, "Would you please come and drive for Enzo Ferrari?" And I couldn't believe it. I was, as they say, gobsmacked by the whole thing. And I would love to have won major races for him. I won a race at Zandvoort, and I beat Jochen Rindt at a place called Levin in New Zealand. That was the only wins I actually had in Formula 2, and of course in Formula 1 I only did about 4 or 5 races.
Richard Atwood joined BRM full-time for 1968, replacing the late Mike Spence.
I became part of the team because, of course, of Mike Spence's demise at Indianapolis, and so, you know, I mean, I wasn't going to turn it down, and yeah, I mean, I was thrown into the hot seat for Monte Carlo. I hadn't been in a Grand Prix car for at least 2 years, and I had a problem in pacing myself for the race because I hadn't, as I say, done a Grand Prix for some time. But yeah, that worked out very, very well. But I think from then on, the car, we got worse as the season went on, and I don't really know why. Whether that was because the link with Mike Spence had gone. Pedro Rodriguez was the other driver in the team, and I don't think he was a particularly good test driver. Basically, the car, to me anyway, seemed to get worse, and I think Pedro had won second place at Spa that year, and that was about all the car did.
Finally, it all came together for Rob Walker and Joe Siffert in the 1968 British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch. In those early days of high wings, when the Works Lotus 49s retired, it was Joe Siffert with Rob Walker's car who went on to take his only and Rob Walker's last victory. In second place, perennial bridesmaid Chris Amon with a Ferrari. Sadly, Siffert died at the same track in 1971, driving a BRM in the Race of Champions. Chris Amon, Mike Hailwood, Richard Atwood, Derek Bell, Peter Revson and Joe Siffert, all great drivers on the fringe of Grand Prix glory.